A Canada Reference Guide. Chapter 1. Basic Canadian Information. Basic Canadian Information. The Canadian provinces and territories and their capital cities are as follows. Alberta, Edmonton, gov.ab.ca. British Columbia, Victoria, gov.bc.ca. Manitoba, Winnipeg, gov.mb.ca. New Brunswick, Fredericton, gov.nb.ca. Newfoundland, St. John's, gov.nl.ca. Nova Scotia, Halifax, gov.ns.ca. Ontario, Toronto, gov.on.ca. Prince Edward Island, Charlottetown, gov.pe.ca. Quebec, Quebec City, gov.qc.ca, gov.pq.ca. Saskatchewan, Regina, gov.sk.ca. Northwest Territories, Yellowknife, gov.nt.ca. Nunavut, Iqaluit, gov.nu.ca. Yukon, Whitehorse, gov.yk.ca. Books about how to do research in general are at number .001.42 or Q180.55 at the library. Try number 917 at the library for Canadian Geography and number 971.0025 or AY414 for Canadian Reference and History. Books about Canadian jobs are at number 331.124 or HF 5382.75 at the library. A reference book about Canadian reference materials may be at number 028.709, number 31, or Z669.7 at the library. Gale.com, 800-877 Gale, probably sells the most relevant reference books around. Many reference books include both the United States and Canada. The major Canadian reference books are Directory of Information Sources in Canada, Master Reference Book. Access to Information, pamphlet about access to government information published by the Canadian Daily Newspaper Association based on ATIA/Access to Information Act. American Library Directory. Associations Canada. Broadcaster Magazine. Canada Gazette, Political. Canada Yearbook. Canadiana. Canadian Advertising Rates and Data. Canadian Almanac and Directory. Canadian Annual Review of Politics and Public Affairs. Canadian Book Review Annual. Canadian Books in Print. Canadian Business and Current Affairs Database. Canadian Business and Economics, a Guide to Sources. Canadian Business Franchise Handbook. Canadian Business Index. Canadian Credit Handbook. Canadian Directory of Industrial Distributors, 800-268-7977. Canadian Directory of Shopping Centres, retailinfonet.com. Canadian Directory to Foundations and Granting Agencies. Canadian Donors Guide to Fundraising Organizations in Canada. Canadian Duns Market Identifiers. Canadian Education Index. Canadian Encyclopedia. Canadian Exporters Catalogue, worldexport.com. Canadian Federal Government Handbook. Canadian Global Almanac. Canadian Government Publications Catalogue. Canadian Grocer, cdngrocer.com. Canadian Healthcare Sourcebook, Sherwood Pub, 18, 6 Penny Court Thornhill, on L3T4ES, 905-889-8505, fax, 905-889-4117, sherwood@interlog.com. Canadian Index, Periodicals. Canadian Journal of Communication. Canadian Key Business Directory, 800 Info DNB, dnb.com. Canadian Law List. Canadian Library Yearbook. Canadian Magazine Index. Canadian Marketing Goldbook. Canadian News Facts. Canadian News Index. Canadian Obituary Record. Canadian Parliamentary Guide. Canadian Peace Directory. Canadian Periodicals Index. Canadian Reference Sources. Canadian Research Index. Canadian Research Index /Microlog. Canadian Register of Research and Researchers in the Social Sciences. Canadian Serials Directory. A serial is a regular publication like a newspaper, magazine, newsletter, or journal. Canadian Sourcebook. Canadian Space Guide, spacejobs.com. Canadian Statistical Index. Canadian Trade Index, ctidirectory.com. Canadian Atlas, Computer Bibliographic Database. Canadian Who's Who. Canadian Women's Business Network, cdnbizwomen.com/directory. Cantech National Directory, Book of High-Tech Companies. Connections Directory of Canadian Organizations for Social Justice. Corpus Administrative Index, Telephone Book Canadian Government. Corpus Almanac and Canadian Sourcebook. Dictionary of Canadian Economics. Dictionary of Canadian Biography. Directory of Associations in Canada. Directory of Canadian Archives. Directory of Canadian Universities. Directory of Federally Supported Research in Universities. Directory of Information Sources in Canada. Directory of Labour Organizations in Canada. Directory of Libraries in Canada. Directory of Public Companies in Canada, micromedia.on.ca. Directory of Restaurants and Fast Food Chains in Canada, retailinfonet.com. Directory of Retail Chains in Canada, retailinfonet.com. Directory of the Arts, Canadian Conference of the Arts, 189 Laurier Avenue E, Ottawa, on KIN 6P1, 613-238-3581. Ispile Canadian Database Directory. Fraser's Canadian Trade Directory, frasers.com. Gale Directory of Databases, gale.com. Guide to Canadian Manufacturers, 800 Info DNB, dnb.ca. Guide to Canadian Photographic Archives. Guide to Federal Programs and Services. Hotel Association of Canada and Motel System Directory, hotels.ca/hoteldir.html. Macmillan Book of Canadian Place Names. Matthews Media Directory, for Canada. Microelectronics Industry in Canada, cmc.ca. Multimediator Company Directory, multimediator.com Directory. National Atlas of Canada. National Directory of Service Companies, 800 Info DNB, dnb.ca. National Media List. Provincial Legislative Record, biweekly, lists new legislation. QL Systems, kin/OLE, Canadian Info Databases. Quick Canadian Facts. Scientific and Technical Societies in Canada. Scots Directory of Canadian Municipalities. Scots Industrial Directory, 800 Info DNB, dnb.ca. Sources, Media Directory. Standard Periodical Directory. Statistics Canada/CanSim Database. Subject Collections, a guide to special book collections. Survey of Industrials, list of companies. Ulrich's Periodical Directory. Union List of Canadian Newspapers. Union List of Scientific Serials in Canadian Libraries. Union List of serials in the Social Sciences and Humanities held by Canadian Libraries. Union List of serials in libraries of the U.S. and Canada. Associationscanada.com/profiles. canada411.simpiatico.ca, Telephone Directory. Canada.com. Canada.org. Canadainfo.com. Canadian Government Publishing. Ottawa, on Kia 0S9. 800-635-7943. 819-956-4800. Fax, 800-565-7757. Fax, 819-994-1498. Publications at pwgsc.gc.ca. Publications.pwgsc.gc.ca. Free catalogue of publications put out by the government covering all aspects of life from taxes to trademarks to taking care of yourself. Health-wise. Canada.ca. servicecanada.ca 800 O Canada 800 465 7735 TTY/TDD Canadian Government Service Information for all departments. Canadian Customs and Revenue Agency, Ottawa, on Kia OL5 613-993-0534 800 461 9999 cra.gc.ca Free booklet I Declare and several others about firearms, vehicles, etc. Canada Deposit Insurance Corp. 800 461 2342 cdic.ca Protects your bank or credit union account up to a certain amount if the bank closes down. Canadian Firearms Centre, Department of Justice, 239 Wellington, Ottawa, on K1A0H8 800 731 4000 CanadaJustice.gc.ca Canadian Institute of Strategic Studies, 10 Adelaide St East, Number 400, Toronto, on M5C1J3 416-322-8128 Fax, 416-322-8129 info@css.ca css.ca Independent, non-profit organization, provides information on a broad range of Canadian issues. Canada.justice.gc.ca 888-373-2222 Basic information about Canada's justice system including marriage and divorce laws. Canadian Standards Association, 5060 Spectrum Way, Mississauga, on L4W5N6 416-747-4000 800 463 6727 Fax, 416-747-2473 CSA.ca The Canadian Standards Association, develops standards for public safety, health, quality of life. Citizenship and Immigration Canada, 888-242-2100 613-954-9019 514-496-1010 Montreal, 416-973-4444 Toronto, 604-666-2171 Vancouver, cic.gc.ca cicnet.ci.gc.ca Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, 125 Sussex Drive, Ottawa, on Kia OG2 800-267-8376 613-944-4000 613-996-8885 Emergency Consular Services, 800-267-6788 Travel Reports, 613-944-6788 Travel Reports. Fax, 800-575-2500 Travel Reports. dfait-maeci.gc.ca dfait-maeci.gc.ca/travel report/menu dfait-maeci.gc.ca/antidrug, drug information dfait-maeci.gc.ca/english/travel/adip-pia, information. Useful free booklets for Canadians traveling abroad bon voyage, but which lists about a dozen other booklets like Crossing the 49th Mexico, Que Pasa? Also travel reports about the world's countries. Elections Canada, 800-463-6868 elections.ca Human Resources and Development Canada, 140 Promenade du Portage, Phase 4, Level O, Hull, QC Kia OJ9, 800-277-9914. 819-994-6313. Fax, 819-953-7260. hrdc-drhc.gc.ca/menu. Jobs, Business. Internal Revenue Service. 60 Queen St. Number 201. Ottawa, on K1P5Y7. 613-563-1834. Fax, 613-230-1376. Revcan.ca. MediaCorp Canada, Inc. 15 Madison Avenue. Toronto, on M5R2S2. 800-361-2580. 416-964-6069. Fax, 416-964-3202. info@mediacorp2.com. mediacorp2.com. Career Books, Newspaper Canada Employment Weekly. Media Link Information Line. 800-387-4643. Tell them what information you are looking for and they will connect you with a business that can find it for you. Micromedia. 20 Victoria St. Toronto, on M5C2N8. 800-387-5211. 416-362-5211. Fax, 416-362-6161. info@micromedia.on.ca. micromedia.on.ca. Several relevant directories. Associations Canada. Canadian Almanac and Directory. Canadian Environmental Directory. Directory of Libraries. Financial Services Canada. Governments Canada. National Library of Canada. 395 Wellington St. Ottawa, on Kia ON4. 613-995-9481. nlc-bnc.ca. Southam Information Products. 1450 Don Mills Road. Don Mills, on M3B2X7. 800-668-2374. 416-445-6641. Fax, 416-442-2020. corporate.southam.ca. Several directories. Canadian Sourcebook. Directory of Canadian Municipalities. Directory of Canadian Schools. Scots Government Index. Student Employment Network. 117 Gerard St. East. Number 1002. Toronto, on M5B2L4. 416-971-5090. Fax, 416-977-3782. sen@studentjobs.com. studentjobs.com. Career Books. Tourism Canada. 235 Queen St. Ottawa, on Kia OH6. 613-954-3830. Fax, 613-952-7906. 800-577-2266. 877-8 Canada. info.ic.gc.ca/tourism. cdn-emb.washdc.org. travelcanada.ca. Veterans Affairs. MS 4000. Kirkland Lake, on P2N3P4. 800-387-0919. Fax, 705-567-1813. vac-acc.gc.ca. Major Canadian websites. For major companies like AOL, Toyota, Polaroid, etc., instead of typing the company name and following it up with .com, try .ca for Canada like Toyota.ca. csr.ists.ca/w3kin/welcome.html, announcements of new Canadian websites. canada.ca/azind/azindex_e.html, Canadian Government. parl.gc.ca/housepublications/publication.aspx, collectionscanada.ca, buyitcanada.com, archives.cbc.ca/topic_index, allcanada.com, askresearch.com/Canada, associationscanada.com/profiles, auctionmart.canada.com, blogscanada.ca, knowledgecanada.com, bodyandhealth.canada.com, canada.com, canada.com/shopping, canada.ca/azind/azindex_e.html, canada.ca/departments/major/depend_e.html, canada.org, canada.worldweb.com, the Canadian Encyclopedia.com, nationsencyclopedia.com/Canada, canada411.simpiatico.ca, telephone directory, canadabenefits.gc.ca, public works and government services, 800-622-6232, canadainfo.com, canadamalls.com, canadaone.com, canadaplace.gc.ca, canadaontheweb.ca, canadatravel.ca, canadiana.org, canadiancontent.net, canadianlifestyles.com, canadianliving.com, canadians-canadiens.gc.ca, federal government, canadianvoices.org, canadianwebawards.com, canlink.com, canlinks.net, canoe.ca, Canoe online newspapers, canpan.com, canuck.com, cbcinfomatrix.ca, cbsa.gc.ca, cbsa-asfc.gc.ca, Canada Border Services Agency, 800-461-9999, cdnnet.ca, collectionscanada.ca, communities.ca, cra-arc.gc.ca, Canada Revenue Agency, taxes, cs.cmu.edu/unofficial/Canadiana, cs.cmu.edu/unofficial/Canadiana/ca-zines.html, Canadian-based online publications, inews.com/Canada, foodshair.net, forums.canadiancontent.net, hc-sc.gc.ca, 866-225-0709, Health Canada, infocanada.ca, infomart.ca, maplechuar.com, search engine, network, nlc-bnc.ca/caninfo/econinfo, basic research, nlc-bnc.ca/canlib/e-catalog, Canadian Library Catalogs, pestcontrolcanada.com, sacanada.org, South African immigrants to Canada, scotsinfo.com/htmpl pages/reference, sla.org/chapter/ctor/toolbox/resource/index, sources.com, thecanadadomain.com, tiac-aitc.ca/English, tourism industry of Canada, topcanadasites.ca, vrl.tpl.toronto.on.ca/internet, cia.gov/libraries/publications/the-world-factbook/geos/ca.html, listingsca.com, Listings Canada, canada.ca, 800 Canada, government information, mailboxes, etc., 800-661 Beck, mbe.ca, worldwide delivery service, basic Canadian websites/Canadiana, accessmag.com, acnielsen.ca, internet surveys, TV ratings, acs-aec.ca, Association for Canadian Studies, acsus.org, Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. AlbertaReport.com. albertasource.ca/aoe/ui/index.aspx, albertasource.ca, the Alberta Online Encyclopedia. allcanada.com. allpr.org, Alternative Magazine. Ancestry.ca. Anywhere.ca. archivescanada.ca, Archives Canada. arctic.uoguelph.ca. asian.ca. asiancanadian.net. askresearch.com/Canada. atlas.gc.ca. atlas.gc.ca/english/index.html, maps. audionetcanada.com. autos.simpiatico.ca. bcarchives.gov.bc.ca/index.htm, British Columbia Archives website. besthealthmag.ca. besthealthmag.ca/eat-well/diet/quiz-how-much-do-you-know-about-weight-loss. bigdatabase.ca. bigdatabase.ca. bigzool.net, Canadian Indians and Eskimo. black-studies.org, Black Canadian. blog.yourmoney.ca. blogscanada.ca, eclecticblogs.ca, Canadian individuals on the Internet. bnn.ca, business. brainyquote.com/nationality/Canadian_quotations.html, Canadian quotes. bsc-eoc.org, Bird Studies Canada. busness-directory-canada.com. ca.answers.yahoo.com. caa.ca, 800-268-3750, Canadian Automobile Association. caa.ca, Canadian Automobile Association. Canada from Space. Canada.com. Canada.com. Canada.com, Canada.com, Canadian news and information. Canada.ca. Canada.ca/a-Canada, about Canada. Canada.ca/main_e.html, Canada site, Government of Canada. Canada.worldweb.com. Canada411.ca. Canada411.simpiatico.ca, address, and telephone directory. Canada411.simpiatico.ca, telephone directory. Canadacaling.com. CanadaCouncil.ca, 800-263-5588, Arts Council. CanadaDirectory.net. CanadaEast.com. CanadaCa.net. CanadaPhotos.info. CanadaPost.ca, mail delivery. CanadaPost.ca, mail delivery. CanadaPost.ca/cpc2/addressm/postalguide/fsmaps/pdf/Canada, type in first three figures of a postal code and get a map of the area. CanadaPost.ca/segment-e.asp, postal code lookup. CanadaProvince.com. Canadas.net. CanadasWalkOfFame.com. CanadasWonderland.com, amusement park. CanadaTransportation.com. Canada-USA.com. Canadian-content.com. CanadianContent.net. Canadian-directory.com. CanadianEconomy.gc.ca/English/economy, Canadian Economy Online. CanadianEncyclopedia.ca. CanadianFreeSpeech.com. CanadianGeographic.ca. CanadianHeritage.org. CanadianHouseandHome.com, magazine. CanadianInstitute.com. CanadianLifestyles.com. CanadianLiving.com. CanadianLiving.com, 800-265-5371, magazine. CanadianLiving.com/forums. canadianparents.simpiatico.ca, canadianplanet.net, canadians.ca, famous Canadians, canadians.org, 800-387-7177, Citizens Watchdog Organization, canadians.org, Council of Canadians, canadiansabroad.com, canadiansoclresearch.net, canadianembassy.org, the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., canadiansoclresearch.net, Canadian Social Research Links, canadians2d.ca, canadian-travel.com, canauthors.org, Canadian Authors Association, canhdian.com, canlearn.ca, Student Loans, a learning website about Canada, canlee.org, canoe.ca, Canoe Canadian Online Explorer, canoe.ca, Online Explorer, canoe.ca Media Network, canoe.ca/jam/home.html, cap.ic.gc.ca, Canada's Community Access Program for Rural Canadians, CaptainCanada.com, casara.ca, Aviation Safety, cbc.ca, Government-owned TV and radio station, cbc.ca, live radio broadcast, streaming, cbc.ca/archives, cbc4kids.ca, cc.com, tickets to events, cca-kids.ca, ccnc.ca, Chinese Canadian, ccrs.nrc.gc.ca/ccrs/imgsurf/tour/touri.html, cdnconsulat-la.com, the Canadian Consulate in Los Angeles, cdnhomecare.on.ca, cdnresabroad.com, Canadians living abroad, celebge.ca, pop culture, cgdi.gc.ca/ccatlas, maps, chatelaine.com, cia.gov/libraries/publications/the-world-factbook/geos/ca.html, silby.com, Canadian Internet Licensing Board, cipo.gc.ca, copyrights, cira.ca, Canadian Internet Registration, civilization.ca, siwa.ca, Injured Workers Alliance, click411.ca, clo.com/canadainfo/eh.html, cmcc.muse.digital.ca, museum, cmhc.gc.ca, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corp, cmpia.ca, Canadian Magazine Publishers, cnf.ca, Nature Federation, collections.ic.gc.ca, Canada's digital collections, collectionscanada.ca, 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 collectionscanada.ca/genealogy, collectionscanada.ca, collectionscanada.ca, collectionscanada.ca/caninfo/econinfo.htm, Canadian information by subject, Library and Archives Canada, contests.simpiatico.ca, lottery, coolh.com, craigmarlatt.com/Canada, facts about Canada, craigmarlatt.com/Craig/Canada/provinces&territories, crc.doc.ca, multimedia technology, crca.ca, canoeing, criaw-icref.ca, advancement of women, crasaft.on.ca, Crafts Ontario, crtc.gc.ca, telecommunications, cscmu.edu/afs/cscmu.edu/user/clement/miscellaneous/Canadiana, cs.cmu.edu/unofficial/Canadiana. cs.cmu.edu/unofficial/canadiana/index.html, Canadiana, the Canadian resource page. cs.cmu.edu/unofficial/canadiana/readme.html, the Canadian resource page. cs.uwindsor.ca/users/c/cacs/university.html, computer science departments at universities in Canada. csod.canadas.net. csr.ists.ca/w3kin/welcome.html, announcements of new Canadian websites. culture.ca, culturenet.ca, culturenet.ucalgary.ca, qso.org, 888-434-2876, Canadian version of Peace Corps, volunteer overseas. cybersmith.net/compuguide/Canada. cindieslist.com/jenkin.htm, Canadian websites. dfait-maeci.gc.ca/Canada-magazine. dinerschoice.ca, restaurant ratings. discovery.ca, discoverychannel.ca, dnd.ca/Department of National Defence. dramarama.ca, pop culture. dri.ca, disaster recovery. educationcanada.com. efc.ca, Electronic Freedom Canada. agali.ca. elections.ca, 800-463-6868. en.video.simpiatico.ca, watch videos. en.wikipedia.org/wiki/list_of_Canadian_awards. en.wikipedia.org/wiki/list_Canadian_senators. en.wikipedia.org/wiki/list_Canadian_writers. en.wikipedia.org/social_insurance_number. entertainment.simpiatico.ca. eposti.ca, paying bills online. estat.statcan.ca, eStat Statistics Canada database. excelir.ca/Winters International, 877-461-5066, cheap long distance. exn.ca, Discovery Channel. exn.ca, Discovery Channel. easyguide.ca. fact-canada.com. famousplayers.ca, movie theaters. fashionism.ca. fashionist.ca. finance.simpiatico.ca. floridabound.com. foundlocally.com. freenet.mb.ca/others/freenets/canada.html, internet use. freenet.victoria.bc.ca/archives/history/text. frenchcaculture.miningco.com, French Canadian. funeralscanada.com/homes. gad.canada2.enroll2.com, who's who in Canada. games.ca.zone.msn.com. genuinecanadian.ca. geonimus.nrcn.gc.ca/cgndb, geographical names. geonimus.nrcn.gc.ca/english/schoolnet. globeandmail.com. globeinvestor.simpiatico.ca. georving.ca, RVs, recreational vehicles. gov.ns.ca/natar/energy/home heat, 866-488-4328, information about energy saving. governmentgrants.com. grantcanada.com, grants. handbook.com. hour.qc.ca, Montreal newspaper. hrdc-drhc.gc.ca/ei, unemployment insurance. hrdc-drhc.gc.ca/isp, 800-277-9914, 800-255-4781, TDD, Canada Pension Plan. hrdc-drhc.gc.ca/sin-nas, social insurance number info. hrsdc.gc.ca, where to get a social insurance number. hyperwallet.com, money exchange, send money, etc. iccs-ciec.ca, Canadian Studies. iccs-ciec.ca/blackwell.html, Canadian Studies, a guide to the sources. idirect.com/Canadian. idmagazine.com, Social South Ontario. ig.gc.ca, Industry Canada. imagescanada.ca/index-e.html, Images Canada. infactcanada.ca. info.ic.gc.ca/ic-data/industry/tourism. info.ic.gc.ca/tourism/Canada. infocanadadirect.com, 800-561-8868, 888-308-2222, call Canada from foreign countries. infomart.ca, Canadian database for a fee. infaux.com, Ukrainian Canadian. infoweb.magi.com/privkin, Canadian Internet Privacy. inmovies.ca. inmusic.ca. island.net/Renata. islandnet.com/jvinot/cghl/archives.html, Canadian Genealogy and History. kijiji.ca/classified ads, housing, personals, etc. nobc.com/iebc/iebc.asp, Encyclopedia of British Columbia. kpmg.ca, accounting, taxes. legion.ca, Royal Canadian Legion. legionmagazine.com. library.educationworld.net/Canada Facts. life.ca. life.ca, Natural Life. livespeak.ca/resources. lifestyle.simpatico.ca/relationships/quizzes/articles/movie_love_songs.htm. lifestyleandwellness.com. lin.ca/htdocs/findars.cfm, National Recreation Database. linksite.ca. livingincanada.com. livingin-canada.com. livingin-canada.com. livingnews.org. lodgingcanada.net. lossilverados.com, Motorbike Group. lottery1.simpatico.ca. manningawards.ca, Creative Canadians. mapleschur.com, Canadian Internet Subject Directory. mcgrawhill.ca, Books. micromedia.on.ca/products, Canadian Almanac. mobile.simpatico.ca. mokazofa.ca, Women's website. molson.com, Beer Co. monitor.ca, Computer magazine. movingto.com, about moving. msn.ca, Microsoft Network. multifest.ca, multiculturalism. multi-medias.ca. multimediatour.com/info, Canadian Computer Info. museums.ca. musicdirectorycanada.com. nationsencyclopedia.com/Canada. nationsencyclopedia.com/Canada. canadiandimension.com. netlinks.net/netlinks/Canada. netminder.com/YVR, Vancouver. news.simpatico.ca. newswire.ca. nfb.ca/Cine access to National Film Board films. niagara.com/Kirsty/bar-list.htm, list of Canadian bars. nielsenmedia.com, Internet surveys. nlc-bnc.ca, National Library of Canada. nlc-bnc.ca/caninfo/ecaninfo.htm, extensive subject listings by the National Library of Canada. nlc-bnc.ca/canlib, Canadian information. nlc-bnc.ca/prime ministers/index-e.html, first among equals, the Prime Minister in Canadian life and politics. nlc-bnc.ca/women/index-e.html, celebrating women's achievements. nrc.ca/expertise, Canada National Research Council Expertise Database. nrcn.gc.ca, Natural Resources. nsb.com, National Speakers Bureau. nsgc.gov/ns.ca/mans, multiculturalism. nt.net. ocanada.ca/en.wiki/list_of_black_Canadians. was.utoronto.ca/empress/eduweb.html, Canadian education on the web. olympicschool.ca, Canadian Olympic School Program. ontariosnowmobiler.com. opera.cbc.ca, pop culture. ourcanada.ca, magazine. outdoorcanadamagazine.com. pages.sprint.ca/tgranger/files/canada.htm. parkscanada.pch.gc.ca. parl.gc.ca, Parliament of Canada. personals.simpiatico.ca. pleaseman.com/cc, Computer Canada. ppt.gc.ca, 800-567-6868, 866-255-7655, TTY, Passport Office. preservation.gc.ca. primaris.com/phone find, area code and telephone, look up, for us and Canadian numbers. privateerdays.com, Liverpool NS Festival. producer.com, Western Canada Magazine. profilecanada.com. publications.gc.ca. publications.pwgsc.gc.ca, publications the government puts together in several subjects and sells to the public. radio.cbc.ca. rcinet.ca, Radio Canada. rcmp-grc.gc.ca. rd.ca, Reader's Digest. realestate.yourmoney.ca. reservatech.net, tickets to events. rights.org/deathnet, Right to Die Canada. rom.on.ca, Royal Ontario Museum. royalblog.ca. rural.gc.ca, Canadian Rural Partnership. parl.gc.ca, Parliament. science.ca. scotsinfo.com, Canadian Information Books. sla.org/chapter/ctor, Special Libraries Association, Toronto Chapter. snowbird.ca. sources.com, Experts in Canada. southam.ca, Chain of newspapers. spindlerrecords.com, Canadian, CD specialists. sports.simpiatico.ca. sdacommunications.com, journals. statcan.ca. statcan.ca, Statistics Canada. statcan.ca, Statistics Canada. statcan.ca, Statistics. statcan.ca/english/estat/license.htm, estat for education, storehouse of statistics about Canada and Canadians. statcan.ca/english/11-008-11-7-008-20060001.htm, Canadian Social Trends, free online magazine from Statistics Canada. statcan.ca/freepub/12-581-yes/12-581-yes/20040001.pdf, Canada at a glance. straightgis.gc.ca/sc_mksv/corpdir/engdocscorpians.html, list of 32,000 Canadian companies. straightgis.ic.gc.ca/sc_innovi/site/eng-doc/search.html, Canadian Research, Technology and Innovation Expert Finder. sun2.cum.qc.ca/octgm, Montreal. swc-cfc.gc.ca, Status of Women in Canada. simpiatico.ca, Internet Service Provider. simpiatico.ca, Search Engine. simpiatico.ca/Tanya H/Canada/Things Canadian Inventions. simpiatico.ca/Tools. simpiatico.ca/Weather. tartans.com, Scottish Canadian. tceplus.com, Encyclopedia. tceplus.com, The Canadian Encyclopedia. tcp.ca, CA, Canadian Computer Magazine. theatlantic.com. thecanadianencyclopedia.com. thecanadianencyclopedia.com. thecanadianencyclopedia.com, Canadian Encyclopedia. thecanadianencyclopedia.com, Canadian Encyclopedia. thecanadiansentinel.blogspot.com, 10q.com/Canuck. theprovince.com. theshoppingbags.com. theweathernetwork.com. This site is a gateway to Canadian images in a vast array of collections held by museums, libraries, archives, and universities. theismag.org, Alternative Magazine. thismagazine.ca.wikipedia.org/wiki/list_of_Canadians. ticketmaster.ca. topics.com/ca. torinfo.org, Toronto. torontodriveaway.com, they drive your car or you drive someone else's car for free. torottawa.org. trajan.com, Collectibles Canada. travel.simpiatico.ca. travelhealth.gc.ca. tribute.ca, movie reviews. turtleislandmedianetwork.com, Indians. tv.org/eh. tvguide.ca. ualberta.ca/J Kerman, Canadian Social Studies Super Site. utoronto.ca/JCB, Living Will Information. utpress.utoronto.ca/CGI-bin/CW2W3.CGI, Canadian Who's Who. utpress.utoronto.ca/CWW/CW2W3.CGI, List of prominent Canadians. vac-acc.gc.ca, Veterans. voiceprintcanada.com, they read news stories over the Internet. volunteer.ca. vrl.tpl.toronto.on.ca, Virtual Reference Library. weather.ec.gc.ca, Environment Canada. weatheroffice.com. webcenter.ca, build your website. webnames.ca. webworldexpo.com. welcomewagon.ca, contact them when you move into a new area. whatsnewcanada.com. women.ca. world66.com/North America/Canada. worldaffairsinc.ca. worldchat.com/commercial/can guide. yahoo.ca. yellowpages.ca. ylm.ca, your local marketplace. ymca.ca. yourlibrary.ca. yourmoney.ca. kin.general. can.jobs. sociculture.canada. canada.ca. 800 Canada. 800-667-3355, Reference Canada. Canadian Government Service Information for all departments. gov.ab.ca, Alberta. gov.bc.ca, British Columbia. gov.mb.ca, Manitoba. gov.on.ca, Ontario. gov.nb.ca, New Brunswick. gov.nf.ca, Newfoundland. gov.ns.ca, Nova Scotia. gov.nt.ca, Northwest Territories. gov.nu.ca, none of it. gov.pe.ca, Prince Edward Island. govi.qc.ca, Quebec. gov.sk.ca, Saskatchewan. gov.yk.ca, Yukon. Canadian events websites. biztradeshows.com/Canada. Canada.ca/about Canada-AUSUJet Canada/celebration/nel_fg-eng.html. Canada.worldweb.com/events/festivals. Canadaevents.ca. Canadaeventscalendar.ca. CanadaFAQ.ca/top+events+social+cultural+evolution. CanadianDesi.com/eventlist.php, Hindu events. CanadianMilitaryHistory.ca/category/events. CanadianPrincess.com/resort/events. Canadians.org/events. CanadiansPekielEvents.com, national publication for the event industry. CanSIA.ca/events/list, Canadian Geo Exchange Coalition. COMIC-con.org. DESTINation360.com/north-america/Canada/events-and-holidays. Adventures.ca, workshops in crafts. en.wikipedia.org/wiki/list_of_festivals_in_Canada. Eventbrite.ca. Events.hellotrade.com/Canada. eventsandshowscanada.com/events-by-date. fantasyeventlist.com/category/Canada-events. festivalseeker.com. healthcareconferences.ca. ihavenet.com/canada.html. lgbt.wikia.com/wiki/list_of_events_in_Canada, gay realbar.com/cgi-bin/Canada/events-list.cgi. sportsnet.ca/gallery/list-greatest-Canadian-sporting-events. thedjlist.com/world/Canada, DJ and dance music events in Canada. tamiandate.com/calendar/?country=27. whenis.in/Canada_holidays_list.html. Canadian geography websites. Go to number 917 at the library. CanadianGeographic.ca. atlas.gc.ca/site/English Atlas of Canada. CanadianGeographic.ca/atlas, Canadian Atlas Online. Canjo.ca, Canadian Geographic. atlas.gc.ca. geoconnections.org. geogradus.cgdi.gc.ca, geospatial data. mapinfo.com. nice.ccm.emr.ca/english/home-english.html. nice.ccm.emr.ca/cgndb/geonomes.html, Canadian geographical names, the National Atlas Information Service Canada. cia.gov/cia/publications/factbook. pc.gc.ca/prog/np-pn/index_e.asp, national parks. canada.ca/canadiana/cdaind_e.html. canadainfolink.ca/geographic.htm. atlas.gc.ca. vgsbooks.com, visual geography. Canadian maps. atlas.gc.ca, Atlas of Canada. atlas.nrcn.gc.ca/site/English/partners, the Atlas of Canada, partners list. uk.multimap.com/index/ca.htm, Canada map and place name index. canadiangeographic.ca/atlas, Canadian Atlas Online. digital.library.mcgill.ca/county atlas/default.htm, Canadian County Atlas Digital Project. Maps.nrcn.gc.ca, Centre for Topographic Information, Natural Resources Canada. Archives.ca. mercator.geographic.utoronto.ca/ha/cddp/page1.htm, Historical Atlas of Canada. infoplease.com/atlas/canada.html, infoplease Atlas of Canada and the Provinces. atlas.gc.ca, National Atlas of Canada. vancouver.ca/vanmap, online map of Vancouver. worldatlas.com/webimage/countries/canada.htm, map of Canada. canadamapexcel.com. geology.com/world/canada-physical-map.shtml. Physical map of Canada, Canada political map. geology.com. atlapedia.com/online/maps/physical/canada.htm. nowpublic.com/physical_map_of_Quebec_Canada. nationsonline.org. atlas.nrcn.gc.ca. etc.usf.edu/maps/galleries/na/canada/index.htm. worldatlas.com/webimage/countries/namerica/ca.htm, map of Canada. worldatlas.com/webimage/countries/namerica/province/onz.htm, Ontario map. yellowmaps.com/maps/ontario_province_map.htm, Ontario map. cia.gov/libraries/publications/the-world-factbook/geos/ca.html, CIA, the World Factbook Canada map. ucalgary.ca/lib-old/maps/canadianmaps.html, canadianmaps.ontario.worldweb.com/maps/provincial-maps-flash/ontario-map.html, Ontario provincial maps. lonelyplanet.com/maps/north-america/canada, map of Canada. mapquest.com/mto.gov.on.ca/english/traveler/map/southindexpdf.html, Southern Ontario road maps. infoplease.com/atlas/canada.html, Canada Atlas atlas.gc.ca/site/english/index.html, The Atlas of Canada. canadamaps.info, map of Canada maps. canadiangeographic.ca/mapping, Canadian Geographic, mapping and cartography. canadiangeographic.ca/mapping/default.asp. geology.com/canada/ontario.shtml, Ontario map and satellite image. You can order civilian versions of military maps of many Canadian cities as well as topographical maps of the general terrain from the Canadian Map Office, Department of Energy, Mines and Resources. 615, Booth St. Ottawa, on Kia OE9. 800-465-6277. Fax, 800-661-6277. DOE.ca. For information regarding nautical maps of the Great Lakes, lakes, and coastal ocean areas of Canada, send a letter requesting information to either of the following addresses: chshq.dfo.ca, Canadian Hydrographic Service, Chart Sales Office, epub 6000, Sydney, BC V8L4B2, 604-363-6445, chartsales@ios.bc.ca. Director, Aids and Waterways, Canadian Coast Guard, Ministry of Transport, Ottawa, on Kia 0N7. Distribution Division, C44. National Ocean Survey, Riverland, Maryland 20840. Hydrographic Chart Distribution Office, 1675 Russell Road, epub 8080. Ottawa, on KIG 3H6. 613-998-4931. Fax, 613-998-1217. CHS sales at chshq.dfo.ca. chshq.dfo.ca. Canadian Statistics Info. statcan.ca. detalib.chas.utoronto.ca/other/findcans.htm. Canadian Telephone Service. architel.com. bci.ca, Bell Canada, Telecom. bctl.com, Telephone BC. bell.ca. bellmobility.ca, mobility.com, cell phones. bellwesternbusiness.ca, Telecom Western Canada. brandtel.com, business telephone systems. Burlington, on. buildingstech.com, Telecom, Ottawa. CanadaReconnect.com, 800-930-6644, get phone service regardless of past history. Choicetel.ca, 888-333-1405. DirectWest.com, telephone books for Saskatchewan. Downeast.ns.ca, Telecom. Eastlink.ca, Telecom, Halifax. Ericsson.com, telephones. gt.ca, Telecom. Interactive.ca, telecommunications. Meteortel.com, Telecom, Toronto. MightSeeTelecom.com, Montreal. Middle.com, telecommunications products, Ottawa. mts.mb.ca, telephone service, Manitoba. Nortel.com, Internet, Telecom. Northerntel.on.ca, telephone services, Ontario. nwtl.ca, telephone, Far North. Phonefactory.ca, 877-336-2274. prairiemobile.com, telephone service for Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Northwestern Ontario. primustel.ca, telephone service. quebectel.qc.ca, telecom. sasktel.com, telephone. sprint.ca, long distance. srtelecom.com, telecom. systemhouse.mci.com, hardware for MCI telephone. telebec.qc.ca, telecommunications. teleglobe.com, teleglobe.ca, telecommunications. telesat.ca, satellite. teletech.com, telephone services. telabs.com, communications. telus.com, telecommunications. tembo.ca, 877-468-3626, get reconnected regardless of past history. westncs.com, telecommunications, cable TV. wisdom.com, telecom, Richmond Hill, on. CanadaReconnect.com. 800-930-6644. Get phone service regardless of past history. Canada Direct Telephone Service. 800-561-8868. Automated long-distance access service that allows you to call anywhere from anywhere using Canada's telecommunications network. Dial the access number of the country you're in and follow the voice prompts. Get information by calling the above number before you leave on your trip. Telephone directory websites: Canada. Canada.com/search/business. CANADA411.ca. CANADA411.com. CANADA411.simpiatico.ca/eng/, Canadian Telephone Directory. CanadaTollFree.ca. CanadaTollFree.simpiatico.ca, Canadian Toll-Free Directory. CanadaYellowPages.com. Infospace.com/info/reverse_ca.htm, reverse telephone directory. Infospace.com/info.mama/cansvcs.htm. Infospace.com/1_43343463463_info/canada.htm. pagesjohns.ca, French. phoneguide.ca. prone.ca, Business Worldwide. Yellowpages.ca. Alberta.com. BCYellowpages.com. DirectWest.com, Saskatchewan. MTSDirectory.com, Manitoba. PhoneDiar.com, Atlantic Area. SASKYellowpages.com, Saskatchewan. ZIP411.net. Canadian ticket websites. TicketLiquidator.com. TicketPro.ca. Ticketmaster.ca. TicketAtlantic.com, Eastern Canada. TicketChest.com. Canadian Weather Info. TheWeatherNetwork.com. AirQualityOntario.com. ClimateChange.gc.ca. Adaptation.nrcn.gc.ca/posters. msc.ec.gc.ca/El Nino. msc.ec.gc.ca/La Nina. msc-smc.ec.ga/education/uvindex/index_e.html. weatheroffice.ec.gc.ca. worldclimate.com/index.htm. ec.gc.ca/water/index.ht. nrcn.gc.ca/kids/index_e.html. canadiangeographic.ca. atl.ec.gc.ca/weather/hurricane/index_e.html. msc-smc.ec.gc.ca/education/severe_weather/index_e.cfm. msc.ec.gc.ca/cd/index_e.cfm number sign fax. climate.weatheroffice.ec.ga/welcome_e.html. ec.gc.ca/tk/cc_weather/s_weather_e.cfm. epa.gov/gln/post/atlas/glotty-ch2.html. ucsusa.org/Great Lakes/pdf/temperature.pdf. great-lakes/envt/refs/weather.html. Chapter 2. Canada Search Engines. Canadian Search Engines. csr.ist.ca/w3kin/welcome.html, directory of Canadian websites. mapleleafweb.com. 411.ca. 411directoryastance.ca. allarticles.ca. allshopping.ca. altavista.ca. altavistacanada.com. aol.ca. bellmobility.ca. bltg.com/people. bltg.com/people/scripts/search_request.pl. boco.com/canada.htm. bravo.ca. ca.altavista.com. ca.altavista.com. canada.ca. canada.com. canada.com. canada.com/shopping. canada.ca, government. canada411.ca. canada44.ca, pay-per-click search. canadacenter.com. canadamaplesquare.simpiatico.ca. canadazeek.com. canadazites.com. canadazites.com. canadaspace.com/Canadian_shopping_guide.html. canadaspace.com. canadaspace.com. canadian-links.com. canadian-links.com. canadianclub.ca, clubs. canadiancontent.net. canadiancontent.net. canadianculture.com. canadiana.com. canadiana.com. canadianwebs.com. canatopedia.com. canfind.ca. canlinks.net. canoe.ca. canoe.ca, Canadian Online Explorer. Canterk.com, Travel. Canuckster.com, Whitepages.ca. Chebukto.ns.ca. cs.cmu.edu, csr.ists.ca/w3can. csr.ists.ca/w3can/welcome.html, directory of Canadian websites. Doubleclick.ca. elocal.ca. excite.ca. friendlycanadian.com. geo.com. google.ca. google.ca. homer.ca. homer.ca/search/canadian.htm. infospacecanada.com. internetnews.ca. intuit.com. io.org/themax/canada.can.html. island.net/Renata. jobs.canadaspace.com. journalismnet.com/canmags.htm. localzarch.toronto.com. lycos.ca. mapleschuar.com. mapleschuar.com. mapleschuar.simpiatico.ca. members.exum.com/ocr. msn.ca. mta.ca/about_Canada/study_guide/world. multimediatour.com, multimedia. mybc.com. mybc.com. meastlink.ca. mysteinbach.ca/search_finder.html. netdeals.ca. netscape.ca. nlsearch.com. nt.net. onwebguide.ca. pagemontreal.com. pointcast.ca. ryerson.ca/journal/megasources.html. search.aol.ca. searchengine-index.co.uk/country/canada.asp. searchenginecolossus.com/canada.html. searchengineguide.org/canada.htm. searchenginewatch.com/facts/regional. seoconsultants.com/search-engines/canada. sources.com. simpiatico.ca/contents. synapse.net/radio/welcome.html. tc.ca, Networks Canada. theanfoguide.com. toronto.com. toronto411.com. travelocity.ca. viarouche.ca. webcanada.net. west-teq.net/associations.htm number sign 1, associations and organizations in Canada. yahoo.ca, ca.yahoo.com. yellowpages.ca. ziplocal.ca. Provincial search engines. British Columbia. mybc.com. mybc.com/yellowpages. searchbc.com. vcn.bc.ca/welcome.html, Vancouver. victoria.bc.ca/bcw3list.html, directory of websites in BC. Alberta. alberta.com. freenet.edmonton.ab.ca. goalberta.com. searchlocally.com. Saskatchewan. gpfn.sk.ca. saskayellowpages.com. sfn.saskatoon.sk.ca. Manitoba. alice.mb.ca. freenet.mb.ca. freenet.mb.ca/othersies/freenets/canada.html. manitobanow.com. mtsdirectory.com. umanitoba.ca/alice/manitoba.html, directory of Manitoba websites. Ontario. freenet.hamilton.on.ca. ncf.carleton.ca, Ottawa. ool-inc.com. torinfo.com. toronto.com. northbayzarchengine.com/directory, Quebec, carafornet.com, toile.qc.ca, New Brunswick, gov.nb.ca/edt/info/biz/index.htm, Nova Scotia, cbnet.ns.ca, Cape Breton, chebucto.ns.ca, island.net/Renata, localhalifax.com, nsonline.com, Nunavut, nunavut.com, Newfoundland, nfinteractive.org, nfld.com, nfol.ca, pagemaker.com/db/links.html, Prince Edward Island, payonline.com, Yukon, whitepages.yknet.yk.ca, yukon.net, yukonzite.com, yukonweb.com.